for those of you who don't know. I'm the Executive Director of BMBRI, and I also have here Scott Heisel, who is co-hosting with me, who is the President of AMBA. And unfortunately, Ashley was unable to join us today. But thank you for joining us for the Sustaining Barley Webinar Series, which serves as a forum for conversation and sharing of great ideas to advance sustainability in the malting barley industry. I want to thank my partners in this series, the American Malting Barley Association and Canadian Malting Barley Technical Centre, and of course, a big thank you to my members of BMBRI. As a reminder, these webinars are being recorded, so if you're interested in seeing previous content, please check out our webinar page, and I'll put a link in the chat for that purpose. We also hope you'll join us next month, where we'll highlight opportunities around the use of artificial intelligence to bolster sustainability within the barley industry. Today we have two great presentations on some of the threats to no-till and conservation tillage that are impacting certain regions of the US and Canada. Many of you will be aware that tillage practices impact carbon sequestration and can significantly reduce the carbon footprint of barley production. This will be a great opportunity to gain a better understanding of these issues and potentially highlight research and opportunity investments. Each of our presenters will speak for about 20 minutes. We will take one or two questions after the presentation and have a full question and answer after both presentations. Feel free to drop questions in the chat or just come off mute and join the conversation. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Charles Geddes, a weed scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada located in Lethbridge, Alberta. Charles grew up on a mixed farm near Pilot Mound, Manitoba, and graduated with a BSc in agroecology and a PhD in plant science from the University of Manitoba. Charles leads the prairie herbicide-resistant weed surveys and research on discovery, characterization, monitoring, management of herbicide-resistant weeds in Western Canada. He has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles, and among other roles serves as the associate editor of the scientific journal, Canadian Journal of Plant Sciences and Weed Technology. So welcome, Charles. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. You should be able to see my presentation there now. Yeah. So as Gina mentioned, my name is Charles Geddes, and I'm a research scientist in weed ecology and cropping systems with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and I'm based out of Lethbridge, Alberta. So today I'm going to be talking about threats to no-till management, and in particular, what I think is one of the biggest threats anyway, which is herbicide-resistant weeds. So to jump right into it here, there are a few points that I'd like to make right off the bat. These points, I mean, this could be an entire presentation in and of itself, but essentially the relationship between tillage and weed management. So historically, tillage was the most important form of weed management when herbicides essentially were not available to manage weeds, right? So it was a very important form of weed management. And the adoption of conservation tillage, or with the adoption of conservation tillage, essentially pre-plant burn down herbicides replaced tillage for weed management before seeding. And so we're obviously with conservation tillage, you have more selection pressure in that pre-plant window, more selection pressure for herbicide resistance. And so tillage systems are important drivers of weed communities, and there's been a lot of research that's been done on this subject and how conservation tillage can shift weed communities. To summarize it all up in general, some of the trends are that reduced tillage systems tend to favor the growth and abundance of perennial weeds, as well as small-seeded annual weeds. So those annual weeds that are more adapted to emerge from very shallow depths within the soil. So just some data from the Canadian prairies here, showing the adoption of different tillage systems. So you can see in the last about 3 decades, we've seen a complete turnover in tillage systems used across the Canadian prairies, switching essentially from conventional tillage back in the 90s to no-till systems predominantly here now in the 2020s. And so along with this, you can also see a change in herbicide use. So on the right here, this figure is showing herbicide sales by active ingredient for the top 10 active ingredients sold in Alberta. And so one of the big things that stands out here is that blue line on the top, which is glyphosate, where we've seen essentially a tripling in sales of glyphosate over a similar time frame. And a large amount of that is due to reliance on glyphosate for that pre-plant window to replace tillage in reduced tillage systems. So we're seeing a steady increase in the discovery of unique herbicide-resistant weeds. When I talk about a unique herbicide-resistant weed, it's the combination of a weed species to a herbicide mode of action. We're currently sitting at about 86 unique cases across the country with a discovery of about 2 new biotypes every year. And so increasing herbicide resistance is important when we consider that we have a limited number of herbicide groups or modes of action to manage these weed issues. So this is just showing the commercialization of different herbicide groups over time. And if you draw it down to the x-axis there, you see that there's been almost a stagnation of release of new herbicide modes of action for the last 4 decades, with only 1 new mode of action released in that time frame and currently not used in prairie agriculture. So one of the projects that I have the pleasure of leading are the prairie herbicide resistant weed surveys. And so we recently completed the 4th round of these surveys across the prairies, and actually this webinar is the first time that I'm presenting the aggregated data from the prairie surveys, so all the prairies together. In this survey, what we surveyed 827 annual cropped fields across the prairie region between 2019 and 2023. Which equated to just over 3,000 samples screened with multiple different herbicides for herbicide resistance. So this is a fairly large undertaking, this survey. And what we do is we visit those fields right before crop harvest and walk a W transect within the field, look for any visible uncontrolled weeds, and then we sample mature seed from those weeds, take those seed samples back where they're grown up in the greenhouse and tested for resistance to different products that should control them. So what we found, aggregating all of this information together, is that about 70% of fields under annual crop production on the Canadian prairies have at least one type of herbicide resistance present. And that was 72% of all fields. So that indicates that 2% of fields were so clean where we couldn't actually collect weed samples to test. But in general, about 70% of fields have herbicide resistance. And you can see how in this figure on the top, you can see how that has increased over time in the various prairie provinces, where essentially since the early 2000s, we've seen a large increase in the percentage of fields that have herbicide resistance present. If you go down to the bottom corner here, about 36% of arable land under annual crop production on the prairies have herbicide-resistant weeds present. And if you increase that to the field area, it's about 71% based on field area. So that could essentially be considered the amount of land where you would be applying an additional herbicide or an additional weed management tactic to target this issue. When we combine that with a survey of farmers' perceived cost of herbicide resistance, what we determined was that herbicide-resistant weeds cost farmers across this region about $658 million a year. So it's not a small issue to any degree. Some of the weeds that we collected most often, so this is just showing the percentage of fields where we collect samples from different weeds. So for grass weeds, wild oat, no surprise there, is the most common weed collected, followed by green foxtail, barnyard grass, foxtail barley, and yellow foxtail. With broadleaf weeds, kochia was collected most often, followed closely by lamb's quarters and wild buckwheat. And then Canada thistle and spiny sow thistle. So this slide is showing the percentage of samples that are tested for each species, or the percentage of fields that we test that have different types of herbicide resistance present. So the surveys focus primarily on group 1 and 2 resistance because those are the most common types of herbicide resistance on the Canadian prairies. And then we also have post-harvest surveys that target kochia and kochia and Russian thistle and multiple different herbicides or other groups for that species as well. But if you look at group 1 resistance here, wild oat, we found about 85% of the fields where we test for group 1 resistance, 85% of those have group 1 resistance present to some degree. And followed, just under 50% of the fields tested for green foxtail and yellow foxtail, which would be mainly an issue in southern Manitoba. If you look at group 2 resistance here, essentially all of the kochia samples that were tested are group 2 resistant. But you see the percentage of confirmation here vary quite widely among weed species. And I'll get into the reason for, I'll get into some other data here to actually, that I think is a bit more telling of the actual issue here. So whereas the previous slide was a percentage of fields that we collect and test each weed species that have that type of resistance, this slide shows overall the percentage of fields that have that type of herbicide resistance. So of the 827 fields that we surveyed, this is the percentage of fields that have group 1 resistant wild oat, for example, currently sitting at just under half of those fields with that issue present. And of course, that issue being quite important to barley production on the prairies. Similarly, green foxtail and yellow foxtail are the other group 1 resistant weeds that showed up in this survey. For group 2 resistance, kochia was the most abundant group 2 resistant weed in just under a third of the fields that we surveyed, followed closely by wild oat, spiny sow thistle, and then a whole range of other weed species that are present in, for the resistant biotype anyway, present in 5% of fields surveyed or less. For group 1 and 2 herbicide resistance, we're sitting at a quarter of the fields under annual crop production on the prairies. So I won't get into this in detail, but these are the data for wild oat across the surveys. And the thing that I wanted to point out here is group 1 and 2 resistance shown as the green dots on this map, and how widespread this issue is across the prairies. So we're seeing a lot of, we first saw group 1 resistance in a wide number of samples, and then farmers, at least in wheat, were using their group 2 herbicides to manage that issue. And now we're also seeing an increase in group 2 resistance where we have the combination of those two together. And of course, group 1 resistance is important for barley production because it essentially limits all of the in-crop herbicides available to manage this issue in barley. I'll talk a little bit about herbicide-resistant kochia here. So the latest round of surveys across the prairies took place between 2018 and 2021. And to summarize it all together, we found that about 3/4 of the samples that were tested across the prairies had glyphosate resistance present, and about 1/4 of those also had dicamba resistance present, or synthetic auxin resistance, or group 4 resistance. Just to show how quickly this issue can spread, this is the survey that was that was conducted the year after glyphosate-resistant kochia was documented in Western Canada in 2011. This was the 2012 survey showing that 4% of the population sampled had glyphosate resistance and none had auxinic resistance or group 4 resistance. But if you fast forward here over about a 10-year time frame, that increased glyphosate resistance increased from 4% of the populations to now 78% of those populations sampled. So just how quickly that resistance traits can spread in this particular species. Also over this 1 decade time frame, we saw a selection for and spread of auxinic resistance to both dicamba and to fluroxypyr as well. So this is showing the timeline of first confirmations of herbicide resistance in kochia. And so you can see the first case of resistance actually dates back to 1976. But over the decades, we start to lose more and more herbicide groups here, where I mean, we have group 5, which is not known to occur in Canada currently. Group 2 resistance present in the 80s, and then group 4 resistance in the 90s, and more recently in Canada. This would be glyphosate resistance, or group 9. Back in 2007 was the first reported case. And then the new type of resistance in kochia is PPO inhibitor, or group 14 resistance, which we documented the first case in Saskatchewan back in 2021. And our colleagues from North Dakota also documented a similar issue there as well in the year later. So this is an important issue when it comes to no-till production because essentially farmers were relying on glyphosate to manage kochia populations before they plant their crops on the prairies. And once we started to see selection for and spread of glyphosate resistance in kochia, many farmers just simply added in that group 14. So they'd be applying a group 9 and 14 mix to manage kochia. So that group 14 tends to work quite well on kochia. And the issue was that was essentially only one effective herbicide mode of action against glyphosate-resistant kochia, which over the last decade has become widespread. So now we're seeing group 14 resistance starting to show up here. And so we have reported it on both sides of the Canada-US border. And so this is just an example of some of the data for group 14 resistance in kochia, just with the rate of saflufenicil on the x-axis and then biomass on the y-axis there. And this is a dose response experiment, and it's the official experiment that's used to confirm new types of herbicide resistance. Overall, what we documented was that the resistant population from Saskatchewan exhibited about 55 to 90-fold resistance to saflufenicil, which means requiring greater than 50 times the rate of the herbicide to actually control it. So it's not simply just a question of can we increase our rates a little bit in this case. Some of our more recent work has gone on to look at PPO inhibitor resistance, or this case, and how it is resistant to the whole range of group 14 products that are available on the market. This is showing the entire group of active ingredients together and the different chemical families within it. Not all of these are used in Western Canada, but we have tested for resistance to foliar activity of saflufenicil, carfentrazone, tiafenicil, pyriflufen, aceflorofin, oxyflorofin, as well as the soil-applied residual activity from sulfentrazone, flumioxazin, and trifludimoxazin, where we've done both foliar and soil-applied activity. And so I'll touch on this a little bit rather quickly. We'll start off with the soil-applied herbicides. So sulfentrazone is a big one that's used to manage kochia populations because it has really good residual control of kochia. So here we're looking at a dose response experiment, or one replicate, with the resistant population in the back compared with 2 susceptible populations in the middle and front. and the rough field rate here is highlighted in red. And so you can see that we are seeing resistance to sulfentrazone in both clay loam and sandy loam soils. However, we're seeing a bit better control in those sandy loam soils because the herbicide is less bound to the soil in that case. Similarly, for another soil-applied residual activity of saflufenicil and trifludiamoxazin, just showing the resistance there. With the foliar dose response experiments, this is showing saflufenicil, carfentrazone, again, trifludiamoxazin. However, if you look at aciflorofin, we actually saw that this group 14 product controlled the group 14 resistant kochia, which is quite interesting. And the same for oxyflorofin as well. Group 14 resistant kochia isn't resistant to all of the group 14s. These diphenyl ethers still seem to control the issue. However, at least in Western Canada, this particular chemical family is not used to a large degree. There are at least 1 or 2 products registered for use in soybean production, primarily in Manitoba, and also horticultural production, but currently not used in broadacre crops that we grow on the prairies. So we've also surveyed across the prairies or screened through our survey samples, and we didn't find any group 14 resistant kochia in 882 samples collected on the prairies between 2018 and 2021. But we have in grower submitted samples, so 2 samples, 1 from West Central Saskatchewan and 1 from Southern Alberta as well. So at current, this issue isn't widespread, but it's one that we suspect will spread quite quickly moving forward. And so this raises the question, what does this mean for pre-plant weed control, which is really where those group 14s are used in our system? And so this table is showing the different herbicide options to manage kochia if you have stacked 4-way resistance to group 2, 4, 9, and 14. And separated into different use windows as well. You can see the soil applied residual window, a foliar applied sort of burn down window before crop planting, and then in crop at the bottom there. And if you look at barley here, the options, I mean, there are a few labeled C or green here for control. But if you focus in on what those options are, you can see essentially all of the ones labeled for control have bromoxynil as one of the main active ingredients, either alone or mixed with a group 27 product. So we're at the point where, I mean, in barley, we're relying on 1 or 2 modes of action, and that's really all that's left, right? So, of course, it could be a very critical issue here moving forward. And so getting close to the end here, but I did want to talk a little bit about what this means, like the link between kochia and tillage. So this is just a survey that was conducted in Manitoba, showing the density of kochia seedlings in different farm fields. And it's separated into 3 different timings. So before crop seeding, this would be the emerged kochia density, then the amount that emerged before the herbicide application, and then after the in-crop herbicide application. And so you can see that most of the kochia population emerges before crop planting, meaning this pre-plant window is really important for that particular weed. And also, tillage is quite effective against kochia. So this is just showing that as kochia seed is buried deeper and deeper in the soil, the emergence of the particular weed declines quite rapidly. So this is one of the reasons why tillage is very effective against kochia. And so given this, it's quite possible, and we've heard anecdotal evidence already of farmers reverting from their conservation tillage to more conventional style tillage, at least for patch management of this particular issue. And so the big issue is that our contemporary weed management systems are largely focused on chemical weed control. And of course, this is a broad generalization, but it's just to show you that there are several other options that are available as well. And moving forward to manage herbicide resistance, we need to be moving toward considering greater use of physical, cultural, and biological management tactics, along with the herbicides that we're using in our production systems. So in conclusion, herbicide resistance is a growing problem, and in particular of relevance to tillage systems are glyphosate resistance, particularly in kochia on the prairies, as well as multiple herbicide resistance in wild oat that are limiting options for pre-plant weed control. And these limited options may cause a reversion to more tillage-intensive systems as well. Really, the solution moving forward is integrating these other management practices in to prolong the useful lifetime of the herbicides that we do have left to manage these issues. So with that said, I'd like to thank all of the funders across the prairies that generously fund our research on herbicide resistance, as well as all of the collaborators and the technical staff that go into making this research possible. And thank you as well for listening. Happy to take any questions either now or at the end.
Thanks, Charles. Very interesting and concerning. Do we have any questions now? You can just speak up or pop them in the chat. Okay, well, we'll come back to this, Charles.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again.
Our second speaker is Dr. Alan Dyer, a professor of plant pathology at Montana State University in the Department of Plant Sciences and Plant Pathology. He's based in Bozeman, Montana, and is responsible for conducting research on disease of spring and winter wheat, as well as for Montana's hay, feed, and malting barleys. Alan's research focuses on ecology, root and seed-borne pathogens, as well as applied research that will help alleviate disease problems for Montana growers. He has experience with sugar beets, potatoes, and cereal diseases, as well as forest pathology. Alan's degrees were earned at the University of Minnesota and Cornell University. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Today, what I want to do is I want to take the basic assumptions from technical debt models and apply it to objectives of this program, which is basically understanding residue management and the future of no-till production systems. I like the technical debt model. This is something I became introduced to when I had the opportunity to interact with computer science scientists. And what I found with the model is that it's a system-based model. And I'm a plant pathologist. You know, we have a lot of tunnel vision in our systems. We have identify a problem, we try to solve the problem, but technical debt models are system-based models. And they do a better job mentally for me in explaining what's happening out there with growers' fields. Conservation tillage and no-till systems are very advantageous for growers. They reduce labor involved in production systems. They improve soil health. They increase soil water recharge, and they enhance profitability in most cases for our growers. And so, it's a great system, not one that I would have chosen originally because of disadvantages, but this is a great system for our growers. But the technical model just tells us really that no system is perfect. And over the years, we've realized here in Montana that there are issues involved with conservation tillage, including we are having problems with soil acidification. We're having problems with planting due to excess of duff. And with regards to myself, we're having problems with the increased survival of pests, as our previous speaker mentioned. Bacchus and Schroer in Kansas, they wrote predictions on conservation tillage and no-till and how they were going to affect diseases in no-till systems. And they predicted that leaf spots and rhizoctonium, pythium root rots were going to increase under no-till production systems. And then other diseases like Cochleobolus, common root rot pathogen, and Pseudosphaerella, the eye spot pathogens, were actually going to decrease. And they were correct about those. These are major concerns on our tillage systems going forward. But Bacchus failed to predict that Fusarium crown rot, at least in Montana, Fusarium crown rot root lesion nematodes have increased as problems in no-till production systems. Fusarium crown rot in Montana and most places is caused by members of the Fusarium roseum group, which include Fusarium culmorum, Pseudograminarum, Graminarum navinaceum. It appears that its importance that there's plenty of early season moisture in order for the fungus to infect the primary lateral roots. And from there, the pathogen moves through the crown and progresses up the stem, causing brown discoloration. And in severe cases, causes blighting or abortion of floral organs. Our survey done in 2008 and 2009 found that 57% of Montana's farmers are significantly affected by Fusarium crown rot. 12%, like shown in that picture on the left, are severely affected by this disease. Why did Fusarium crown rot become a problem in Montana? Well, Montana was traditionally a wheat fallow production system. And the adoption of no-till allowed for better water recharge. And so our growers, when adopting no-till production, also adopted wheat-on-wheat production. And as demonstrated by this slide here, wheat-on-wheat increased disease pressure in this system. So here on the left, we have McNeil, which is a Fusarium tolerant variety, and Shoto on the right is a Fusarium intolerant variety. And in the first year of this trial, Shoto actually outproduced McNeil. But as you can see in the image, Fusarium crown rot has come in and devastated the Shoto plots in the second year of the trial. The other issue for us was that we had a transition from this in species that were involved with Fusarium crown rot. In conventional production systems, we had Fusarium culmorum. And this pathogen produces these large macroconidia that have thick walls that allow the pathogen to survive in the soil. As we transition to conservation tillage, we also transition to Fusarium pseudograminarum. Pseudograminarum has these thin-walled macroconidia that are unable to survive in the soil and are readily sliced by the bacteria in that soil. Our studies have shown that consistently Fusarium pseudograminarum is a better crown rot pathogen. And that's only from a perspective of plant pathologists. I think the growers would say it's a worse crown rot pathogen. But consistently, Pseudograminarum and Graminarum are warmer weather pathogens and cause more damage crown rot than Fusarium culmorum ever did. The other issue that was exacerbated by no-till production in Montana was Pralines neglectus. Pralines neglectus is the root lesion nematode. We found it to be a substantial issue in our winter wheat production areas in surveys conducted in 2006 and 2007, where we're getting average nematode numbers per kilogram of soil between 3,000 and 4,000 nematodes. This amounts to an estimated 12 to 14% yield loss for our growers, or about $70 million a year. Pralines neglectus was populations were enhanced by no-till adoption of no-till production, recrop, and winter wheat production. So the third assumption of the technical debt model is that technical debt is basically servicing those imperfections, right? What do we do about these things? Do we just accept the losses that occur? In the Fusarium crown rot system that we have, we encourage three basic things besides standard issues, but we encourage seed treatments. We focus on planting depth, and we use crop rotation. Products like Evergol, Raxel Pro, and Vibrance consistently give our growers a 2 to 3 bushel improvement in their yields in years where fusarium is not strong. But in some years, these agents are capable of providing 10, even 15 bushels improvement in yield. The other thing we found associated with fusarium crown rot is the crown depth of the plants being grown. This particular was associated with, in this case, was a paired plot trial for varieties and their relative resistance to fusarium crown rot. What we found was about a third of the losses associated with fusarium could be linked to the crown depth of that particular variety. How we manage crown depth in Montana is we encourage growers to target a 2-inch planting depth or less. We encourage them to be careful about furrow closure. And then also we've been focusing on improving the genetics of varieties. In the pictures you have on the right, you'll notice that this is 2 pictures from a field where their grower used a disc planter. And they had a problem with getting furrow closure. So in both cases, because of the furrow closure issue, the crowns were produced right at the seeding depth. And in some cases, that seeding depth was fairly shallow, and so the plants were relatively healthy. But in the case on the right, the plants were at a depth of 2 inches. And so not just the crown is buried, but the stem of the plant is buried. And the fusarium is able to get in through that stem tissue, which is very susceptible to fusarium and cause considerable problems. As mentioned before, we realized that residues were an important issue in fusarium management due to the fact that we had this transition to pseudograminearum. And so we did a trial looking at survival of fusarium using quantitative PCR. On the y-axis, we have the copy number of fusarium as a de facto measure of the population of fusarium in the residue. And then across the bottom, we have days after the first harvest of our crop. And you'll notice that basically within a 1-year time span, we have a 96 to 98% reduction in fusarium populations. If we go to the additional year, that actually increases by an additional 80% reduction. So we realized that rotation was going to be a critical issue for fusarium crown rot management, and we've been promoting the adoption of pulses in rotations for controlling fusarium crown rot. And that's not based on my own work. That's based on the work of Dick Smiley out there in Pendleton, Montana, Oregon, and where he did some excellent work on that. The nice thing about that is that these pulses and barley in rotation with wheat have been excellent for us in controlling Pralicus neglectus as well. And those growers that adopt rotations with those crops have experienced more than a 90% reduction in costs or losses due to Pralicus neglectus as well. One of the other basic assumptions of the technical debt model is that technical debt is going to increase over time. And that's what we're finding with our system as well. So once we adopted pulses, and that's been about 10 years that we've had heavy adoption of pulse production in Montana, we've started noticing a transition from pseudograminearum to Fusarium avinaceum. Fusarium avinaceum is a fairly aggressive crown rot pathogen, but it also is a very aggressive pathogen on the pulses, peas, and lentils particularly. With regards to root lesion nematode, the nematode Pralicus neglectus, we had consistently been using the root lesion nematode to control the pulses and barley to control this nematode. And what we see here in our most recent survey, when we analyze the reproductive rate, you can see at the bottom that wheat is a very good in reproducing the nematode, increasing the population 13-fold on average in one growing season. But normally, when we first adopted these processes, all the other crops that we have listed there would be below 1, which means that when we use those in crop rotations, that the nematode populations would decline. But we have been selecting for, and we've found populations that are capable of attacking barley, and we have also found populations that are capable of attacking lentils as well. The other big part of adoption of pulses is that and barley, is that we seem to have been selecting for a new species of root lesion nematode called Priolingus thornii. Priolingus thornii, as you can look at the reproductive factors, actually is quite happy growing on peas and barley and wheat and lentil. And so we have a new problem with this nematode that we're just starting to address in Montana. Ultimately, the technical debt model that's used in computer science systems states that basically at some point technical debt is going to become so large that it necessitates significant changes to the system. What changes are we going to look for? I'm not completely certain. But here and with my colleague, you know, a lot of our job is protecting niche space, you know, using some ecological terms, but the weed scientist is protecting the crop growing environment for the crop. And us in plant pathology, we are using, does everybody hear me? We are using, you know, the crop is the niche that we're using. And I think we're seeing that there's a change in our philosophy, that we're going from just protecting that niche space to asking that our farmers create a more dynamic niche space so that we maintain open space and protect these niches by preventing adaptation by the pests. Perhaps in the future that will be directed by artificial intelligence. In a system of focused world, nothing is intuitive. I've been working in plant pathology for 40 years, and I'm always surprised by how some small change we make causes some big change to happen in the system. And I just want to demonstrate some of the things I've noticed here in Montana over the last 20 years. Stevens in 2013 showed that interactions between pests are very common, particularly if the pests are in close proximity to each other. And the majority of those interactions are antagonistic. They don't like each other. And we don't like them either, right? In Montana, what we have discovered is that Fusarium species and Cochleopsis sativus are competitors. And if you look at this graph here, we have on the y-axis, we have Cochleopsis populations as measured by quantitative PCR. And then on the x-axis, we have Fusarium populations. And this is a plot of average populations of Fusarium and Cochleopsis across the state. And there's a negative correlation between the two at the county level. And we also see that at the state, excuse me, at the field and in the individual plant dynamics as well. And while I can't prove it, I do notice that several of our fields in which Fusarium is outrageously a problem, this grower had. This is what his field looks like every year for the last 10 years. Those fields oftentimes are fields where Cochleopsis is completely eliminated from the field. Similarly, Fusarium graminearum is not always a problem. Here's a plot, some data from a student of mine, Madison Nixon, and she shows that on the left side, growth of downy brome, cheatgrass. And without inoculation, we get this strong, large biomass to shoot to root ratio. But when we inoculate with Fusarium pseudograminea, which is on the right, we get a significant reduction in downy brome. A lot of the plants are killed. And that effect of the Fusarium pseudograminea is enhanced when we use a nitrogen fertilization, as you look at those red box plots. Fusarium also kills sawfly. Fusarium pseudograminearum, in fields where we inoculated with it, we get 80% mortality over the winter period for Fusarium pseudograminearum, 70% for Fusarium culmorum, and for Fusarium avinaceum, we're at 40%. So right now, I'm kind of wondering what's going to happen as we transition from Fusarium pseudograminearum to Fusarium avinaceum. What's going to happen with the wheat stem sawfly pressures in Montana? So in the end, I just want to emphasize, cropping systems are systems, and they're never perfect. Servicing those imperfections are something that's always going to happen no matter what the system we have. And we have to expect that those servicing things are going to change, increase over time until we decide to make some significant changes to the system. But no system is perfect, and change always involves risk. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Alan. Do we have any questions? I see there's a couple in the chat. Maybe we'll go to those first and we'll come back. For Charles, do you think some of the chemistries available in wheat have potential in barley and just haven't been registered yet, or is barley sensitive to these chemistries?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think I guess first of all, I'll start off by saying the majority of tolerance testing, right, looking at that sensitivity is done by crop protection companies. So, I mean, whatever I say has a certain level of speculation in there because I don't know everything that they're testing, obviously. But I mean, barley, I think is enough acres, especially like across the prairies, that I think it would be a priority for a lot of those crop protection companies to be screening barley along with wheat and other grass crops as well, right? So I do think that the majority of the limited options in barley is due to sensitivity of barley rather than barley not being tested. But I do think also that there may be a few select cases where it hasn't been tested or it just hasn't been registered yet, because obviously wheat being higher acreage is more of a priority, right? So you may also see a bit of a progression where a product that would work in barley might be registered in wheat first and then barley after, right? So that could play a minor role, but largely it's a sensitivity thing.
Thanks, Charles. The next question from Mary Jane, it's for Alan. And is there a chance that pulses in rotation will further deplete barley acreage?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I don't know. You may not be able to answer this.
I think the issue for us with barley acreage has nothing to do with the pulses themselves. I think the acreage has to do with the pressures on barley in terms of pests, fusarium head blight, and achieving malt are going to be the issues that drive barley adoption or the decline in it. The pulses are a good crop for us, and people make good money off of them, but I don't see them replacing barley.
Another question for you, Alan. Do you think the effects of fusarium on stem sawfly are mediated by mycotoxins?
Yes. When I started working on getting my talk together, I had like 180 slides. And one of the things, the biochemistries of these pathogens are just extraordinary. They are really out there trying to kill each other and exploit any opportunity. And mycotoxins is a big part of what they do.
Great. Any other questions?
I have a question for Charles.
Go ahead.
Charles, could you address the relative competitiveness of the different crops to kochia in Canada?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a little bit of research that's done. It's kind of piecing together multiple different studies rather than testing it all in the same study. But so overall, what we've found is that some of the winter annuals are the most competitive for kochia, specifically, largely because of the timing or the phenology of the crop and how it matches with the weed, right? So for winter wheat, for example, it's already established in the spring when kochia is just emerging, so it's more competitive there because it has a head start, right? But then also it's harvested when right around the time when kochia just starts to produce seed. So you can essentially decapitate the kochia and remove it or help prevent it from going to seed in that year as well. So the winter annuals we're finding work quite well. We've done some research on other winter annuals as well. But for the summer annual crops, which would more closely match the phenology of kochia, it's mostly, I guess, speculative at this point, right? But in general, across weed species, barley is actually one of the most competitive crops that we grow on the Canadian prairies, right? So there's a big bonus for barley production, I think it is something that could also be bolstered with seeding rates as well. Behind barley, wheat isn't quite as competitive as barley, but it is still up there and something where seeding rates really help as well. And canola, I kind of think of as in between those two. So just as an example, but then you get into your pulses, which unfortunately the majority of them are rather uncompetitive, right? So lentil not being very competitive at all with kochia. Peas maybe a bit more. Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask a question. I don't have much expertise in herbicide chemistries, but one of your slides showed the lack of development of new herbicides over decades. And is that due to that we've exploited all of the modes of action, or are there other reasons why we're not getting new chemistries?
Yeah, so it's a combination of factors. One of the reasons is the lowest hanging fruit is already taken, right? Where it becomes harder and harder to identify new chemicals that have different activity on plants over time, right? But the other factor in there is the widespread adoption of herbicide resistance traits in crops, right? So especially in the States and also in canola in Western Canada as well, right? A lot of the companies that traditionally focused on herbicide discovery shifted over to focusing on herbicide resistance traits in crops instead. So we could use broad spectrum herbicides like glyphosate, for example, in crop, right? So is also at least due in part to a shift in the focus of those companies. And over time, we've seen a decline in the number of crop protection companies that operate as well, right? So there's now a few big players in the space and not as many small ones as well. So it's a combination of those factors together. But with that said, we are seeing companies starting to focus a bit more on the discovery side now that we have widespread resistance to some of those products, like glyphosate, for example, that were used in Roundup Ready crops.
Interesting. Any other questions? Oh, got one here. You can probably read it out, Charles. It's for you.
Yes. So the question, do you think higher stubble to reduce tumbling kochia and help to stay in place or in place area farm? Essentially, how does that play a role? So thinking about stripper headers for stubble height. And I think that's so it's not something that I know of being tested, but I mean, from a practical perspective, I think that it would actually make a lot of sense, right? Where taller stubble is more readily would catch those kochia tumbleweeds as they're blowing across the landscape. I mean, traditionally we had fence lines and shelter belts to do that for us, but with those being removed across broad acreage, there's now I mean, kochia would be tumbling further and further, right? But with higher stubble, I do think that that may play a role in slowing down and helping to prevent that movement from field to field. But hasn't been tested to my knowledge anyway.
Hey, Charles, you talked about once you get resistance, adding a new chemistry to an existing resistant chemistry. You know, tank mixing two different herbicides. Is that real common, or is it better to maybe alternate chemistries rather than, you know, risk the introduction of, you know, just more resistance into weeds, dual resistance?
Yeah. So there's been quite a bit of research on it, on sort of herbicide rotation versus tank mixing, right? And the majority of the research that's been done is based on models, obviously, because resistance selection takes place over decades, right? So what the models suggest actually is that if you have, say, two effective herbicide modes of action, and your option is to rotate between one and the other, say year after year, versus mixing those two together and using it every year. Actually, the mixture of the two together seems to prevent resistance to a greater degree than rotating between them. And so there's a lot of other factors that play a role in there related to the biology of the species and different mechanisms of herbicide resistance. But in general, most of the models suggest that mixing them together is actually superior.
Last call for questions. I'm not seeing any. So with that, I would like to thank our presenters. Very interesting topics, and thank you for taking the time. We will have a recording of this webinar, and